Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Almost everybody here knows me, but I'm Philip Hughes, Senior Vice President of the Council, and probably the longest live member of the Council, maybe at this stage. Welcome to our spring conference dedicated to Mr. Putin's war. Thank you all for coming. It's great to see so many colleagues and friends here in the audience. My happy job this morning is just to open the conference and set the stage a little bit for our discussion. So I won't read you the op-ed that I wrote for those remarks. I'll just try to highlight. In his Wall Street Journal column last week, Bill Galston listed a half a dozen ways in which the Ukraine war, something that's riveted everybody's attention and it's the focus of today's conference, a half a dozen ways in which the Ukraine war, now starting its 12th week, has changed modern history. Not only is NATO no longer obsolete, as President Donald Trump at various times remarked, or brain dead, as France's President Emmanuel Macron suggested, it's revitalized, refocused, soon to be rearmed, and ironically, thanks to Mr. Putin's war, apparently soon to expand further. If that weren't obvious before, it is certainly obvious now why all those former members of the Warsaw Pact, the collective security alliance best known for its tendency to periodically invade itself, why those former Warsaw Pact members applied for NATO membership and what it was that they wanted to be protected against. Second, Germany has reversed course on security policy, replacing the echoes of 1970s Ostpolitik with a commitment to increase its defense spending to at least 2% of GDP, significantly rearm its military forces, and provide lethal assistance to embattled Ukraine. Europe has been forced to face up to its dangerous dependence on Russian energy and to do something about it. Putin's aggression, says Galston, united an increasingly fractious US public opinion like nothing since 9/11. And Mr. Putin's war has forced the US to reprioritize prevailing in a great power struggle in which hard power plays a determining role over the assortment of transnational issues that have recently dominated our policy concerns. That's Galston. But the implications of the Ukraine war are even wider, it seems to me. If Putin gets away with conquering Ukraine piecemeal, as seems to be the only available route now, thanks to Ukraine's spirited and effective defense, or otherwise, no smaller, weaker, non-nuclear, non-aligned nation will be safe from potential aggression by a larger, more powerful neighbor. Nuclear non-proliferation has been dealt a body blow by the example of a Ukraine victimized by its stronger nuclear armed neighbor having given up its own significant and inherited nuclear arsenal. If powerful nations are able to conquer weaker states for geostrategic advantage, to achieve geographic or economic or natural resource or for other reasons, we'll return inexorably to the law of the jungle that prevailed in the 19th century. A era of conquest and the victimization of the less powerful by the more powerful. For sure, the microstates that I used to represent our nation to, places like the Eastern Caribbean, depend on a world where the post-World War II rule of no territorial conquest, no forcible change of borders without popular consent, where that rule prevails, and Putin has threatened it. And who will ever be able to trust Russia again about anything after their betrayal of the Budapest Memorandum, not to mention the UN Charter, the Helsinki Final Act, the norms of the OSCE, etc. So our conference today may not give us answers to, or even the opportunity to explore all of these historic implications of Putin's stunning and brutal aggression. But we'll have the advantage of insights from 10 leading experts who will address, in our first panel here, the war itself, its background, course, likely next steps, and perhaps outcome scenarios. Second, the world's response, Russia's economic vulnerabilities, strengths, weaknesses, the impact of future potential financial sanctions and economic sanctions, the implications of energy sanctions. Third, the security implications for Ukraine's and Russia's Western neighbors, NATO's Eastern Front, and in the Baltics. And a geostrategic wrap-up by noted columnist Walter Russell Mead of the Hudson Institute. So that's what's on the docket for today. And it's my pleasure now to introduce the distinguished chairman, moderator of our first panel, Governor and Ambassador Jim Gilmore. This is a youth test.
Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be part of this distinguished panel this morning that's going to address these issues that Phil has introduced. The audience here are all former ambassadors, so they've all been through the process. They've all served in foreign countries, been confirmed, nominated by the president, confirmed by the Senate. So this is a very good audience, gentlemen, for you to be able to address, and we're very grateful for you to be here and to be a part of it. So I'm going to introduce a few ideas and set down a few of our procedures and then introduce our panelists one by one. And I'm delighted to have a chance to be here. I think that Phil has raised some very important questions about this. I'm going to raise a few issues and then we'll see, but it's very much an echo of some of what Phil has said. Pandora's box is now open. This is a new day and a new entire situation in my view. And we don't really know what's going to happen. I think our panelists will give us some of their insights and maybe we could have a little look at the crystal ball from these three experts. My view, though, is that the statement that Vladimir Putin has made that this is about Russian security is just not true. That's not the motivating factor here. And if you understand the motivating factor, then maybe you can figure out what American and our allies' policy ought to be as we try to work through this. It's not a matter of Russian security. This, in my view, is if you read Vladimir Putin's essay that he wrote with respect to his future plans with regard to Ukraine, it seems to me that this is an effort on his part to place himself in Russian history as the man who reassembled the old Russian or Soviet empire. That is what I think that he has in mind, and Ukraine is the essential first step. He can't do it unless he takes charge and controls Ukraine one way or the other. And that would begin to explain this almost complete destruction that we're seeing right now. I was in Kyiv in May of 21. I was in Mariupol. It's shocking to see the thing that's going on there. The second question I think for me is that we really are in kind of a direct war. We've never seen this before since World War II. Two nuclear powers are in standoff against each other. You remember Charlie Wilson's war, where they really made an effort to try to disguise American involvement there, to stay away from this direct confrontation. Well, we're pretty obvious right now what we're doing. We're supplying materials to the Ukrainians for their defense. So there's really a conflict going on right now between 2 or 5 nuclear powers under a nuclear umbrella. We've never seen this before. But right now I observe that the Russians are allowing us this fiction that we are giving Ukraine the things to defend themselves, which is very justifiable. But you can't avoid the fact that this is a very dangerous conflict between 2 nuclear armed powers. And third, and most importantly, I think this is a shattering of the international order. Having served at OSCE in Vienna, I'm very aware of the Helsinki Accords that were entered into with Russia and the United States and others, that there are certain principles that are planned here: integrity of countries, not aggressive warfare, human rights. These things are all now up in the air. This is a new day, really, in the world today because of this war that has been introduced. That is the significance of what's going on. So what do? I keep hearing this talk, well, we have to have an off-ramp for Vladimir Putin. Well, you know, we have to have a negotiated, we all have to return to the negotiating table. Well, that's all about compromising, giving him something in return for his aggression. If you do that, then once again, the doors are open for further aggression. What does China think about that? What does North Korea think about that? What does Iran think about that? If aggression pays, then that invites more aggression. That is the dilemma that we're in. Nobody wants this war to go on. Nobody wants this destruction. How do you get out of it? And I think the panelists can give us some insight on this. So we'll begin now. I will just stop by saying that I think there's something really noble about a country at this time and this age that's willing to actually fight for itself and fight for its people and its independence and sovereignty. This is really quite an example for the future. It may be that Ukraine provides really great leadership for the 21st century because of their commitment to themselves and to their people. With that being said, we thought we would try to give each of our panelists here about 10 minutes and then leave a little time for interaction with all of the ambassadors here in the room until we get to the 10 o'clock hour. Our three panelists are very distinguished. The order in which I propose to move forward would be to start with General Keith Kellogg, then Michael Hanlon, and then end with Bill Taylor, who was kind enough to address us yesterday, so he can do a bit of a wrap up, I think. General Kellogg is a very distinguished, highly decorated United States Army Lieutenant General. He's co-chair of the Center for American Security and First Policy Institute. He was the National Security Advisor to Vice President Pence, and served as Chief of Staff and Executive Secretary of the National Security Council. So why don't we begin with General Kellogg, and then we'll move over there to Mr. O'Hara. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Thank you, Ambassador. Well, I'm just going to start high low. What I mean by high low, I'm going to start very high and take where I focus primarily on the military aspects of what we've seen in the world with Russia and Ukraine. At the high level, you know, one thing about the ambassadors that are out there, thank you for having me today, is that you were the ambassadors that are eyes and ears forward in these foreign nations. That's the reason why I'm so disappointed that we still really don't have an ambassador in Kyiv that was nominated. We are missing out now. You know, the same thing when you look at Ambassador Sullivan in Moscow, who was a friend of mine. You know, he really didn't get out very much and see very much, but they're so key. The ambassadors are so key in those nations. Also, the chief executive of the Nation Council, and you saw that in Zelensky. You know, you have to admire a man. When we were trying to get him out of there, said, "I don't need a ride, I need ammunition." I said, "Okay, I can probably do it at that time." And I had the opportunity to meet him with Vice President Pence when we were in Warsaw 2 years ago. And you got to measure the man, and you could see he was an incredibly charismatic individual, and you could kind of see into his soul, see the kind of person that he was. And I think we underestimated Ukraine, we underestimated, and we overestimated the Russians. What I mean by that is when you look at our military, the United States military, you look at Mark Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, who testified in Capitol Hill, saying that Kyiv would fall within 3 days of the Russian onslaught. We're now in our third month. So that was brought up yesterday as well in the areas when our intelligence community really didn't get this one right, much like they didn't really get the Afghanistan one right as well. That's a subject for frankly another day. But when you look at what happened with the Russian military, it was stunning to me to watch this, because all of us thought we'd grown up in the Cold War. I spent 5 years in Germany when it was there, it was Warsaw Pact. So you looked at an army that at that time was quite large, quite well trained, quite tough. So you took some licenses to think it was got to be kind of the same army. Fortunately, when I was the NSC chief of staff, I brought in somebody by the name of Fiona Hill, who worked at Brookings, who was an exceptionally talented individual, truly an anti-Trumper, but I really didn't care because I wanted to find out. I needed to have what I thought was the best expert on Vladimir Putin that happened, Fiona. And I think she is quite talented about it. And she said, you know, she told me early, said, Putin's biggest mistake, his fatal flaw, is he does not understand the West. And boy, that's happening in spades. The furthest he came west was East Germany, into Dresden when he was a KGB officer. And he does speak English, by the way. I doesn't do it. And the reason I know that was on 18 different phone calls with him, with the President of the United States, with President Trump. And he would correct his interpreter on several occasions. The only, you know, a lot of times with the jokes, I said, okay, the only guy who would correct them if you know, that he knows that doing it. And I had to go back to my college Russian, which was, I barely got through it. Steve Smith were capable, not very good at that. I was able to pick up a little bit of what he said. I said, I kind of get this one here. But when you go down to the military, what he did is I said, why did this thing happen that this military did not perform well? And they really have not. They are not a 10-foot tall army and they weren't when they came across. And I go back and I said, okay, what did I miss when I was looking at the Russian army and why did they stall out and what happened? And frankly, they violated every, what I would call in the military, every principle of war that the United States military works on. You know, unity of command, there was no single commander out there. When you talk about mass, they came across 5 axes. Focus on your one main axis, which is take key, decapitate the government, install your own government out there, declare victory, go home. They didn't do that. They failed in that regard. They lost some very good units in trying to do that. Primarily their VDV or their airborne units and other special operations units were tremendously shot out, defeated in trying to do that. When you look at simplicity, very, very complex plan that nobody had an ability to figure out who was the right main axis for advance. Recently, when you saw what Putin did, he finally put a senior officer in charge. Now happens to be Gerasimov, who's Mark Milley's counterpart, put him in charge. Vornikov was the one he said earlier was out there, but he never had a single unit of command. And the biggest flaw was that they couldn't fight what we call in the American military combined arms. They couldn't put the armor and the infantry, the artillery, and the air, everything together to advance forward. When I was first asked this on a television show, what's your philosophy? I said it's called IFR. And what's that? I said, I follow roads. And when you look at it, they were going down roads. And if you want to have a perfect example of how to get shot up, is go down roads. The other thing they did on the road coming into Kyiv, it was a 2-lane highway. They came down both lanes of the highway. I would have advised them, you know, tanks do run out of gas. And even if they're idling, they're going to run out of gas. And if you have 2 lanes occupied and you can't get off road, how are you going to get your fuel trucks forward? They couldn't. And so the logistics failed tremendously. These are things that are so simple that my 8-year-old grandson could probably figure out on his own. And they couldn't do it. And it was stunning to watch this go. And it fell apart. So I dug a little bit deeper. And I said, how did the Russian military fall themselves so badly? And I said, it goes back to their operational philosophy, which the guy named Gerasimov, again, is their senior military officer. The program that he wrote was called an active defense. He separated the organization, and the fighting units you see, if you read in the paper, are called BTGs, Battalion Tactical Groups, 800 to 1,000. But they're not like we are with our army divisions and our brigades fighting like that. They fight independently. Well, then they're going to be defeated independently. And that's exactly what happened. They weren't good, well-trained together, side by side, and there was a fatal flaw that they came up with in their philosophy of the military, which was an active defense. Gerasimov created a military that was fighting defensively and had never been intended to fight offensively. And if you read his background and what he's done, that's where you start to see how did they kind of mess this thing up. And it's basically because they do train that way. And they're not a very well trained organization that we're seeing as well, not good chain of command. Second part of that is the way they fight is different than the way the Americans or the Allies fight, where we use our officers, non-commissioned officers, and then our soldiers out there. They don't have that middle group. They don't have the young lieutenants. They don't have, the command and control for example. In every single thing in the Russian military, it used to be you had an officer in every tank. We don't do that. We have an officer for every 5 tanks. So once they started losing their officers, their generals had to fight forward. That's the reason you lost statistically either 6, 7, or 8 generals out there, which is highly unusual. Data point, we lost 1 in Afghanistan, general officer. We lost 5 in all of our time in Vietnam. They've lost at least 8 so far. So you start looking at the fatal flaw of the military. And so how do they compensate for that? How the Russians compensate for that is artillery. Look at what happened in Mariupol. And they'll use that artillery. So that's the reason it's been so important that we in the West have supported the Ukrainians with heavy artillery, multiple launch rocket systems that are out there to match up with the Russians and distance the Russians, so they can fight in this attrition battle that they're going to start to come up with. And because now it's gone from a different phase, we're now in a different phase of the world, that it's going to be an attrition fight in the long term. And if we can match up with the Russians with the artillery and allow the Ukrainians to do that, it'll be a stalemate, it'll be a stagnation. And then the question is, then it turns over to people like you, the diplomats in the world. How do you get out of this mess that is now created? But I said this early on, after about the 5th day, I said, Ukrainians are winning this fight. And I stand with it now, they are still winning. And to me, winning is not letting the Russians win. The Russians cannot take Ukraine as a whole. Because people forget how big Ukraine is, the second largest country geographically in Europe. I mean, if they went from the Dnieper River further west, that's another 400 or 500 miles of distance that you've got to go. And you're in Indian territory. What I mean by that is 90% of the population does not speak Russian. They speak Ukrainian or something else out there. So now you're in true battle. He can't get there. He just doesn't have the troops to task to do it. So he had hoped to, I think, go to the Dnieper, declare victory, landlock Ukraine, and then just walk out. So on a military scale, and I'll wrap up, I think he's got enormous problems. I don't think he can figure it out, and I don't think he can solve it. I said right now he cannot win this war militarily. He just can't. Now, if you define militarily, there's the Donbass region, and maybe try to make Ukraine landlocked. If that's his sense of victory, there's a potential for him to do it. But for Ukraine as a nation, Ukraine will survive. They will get through this. Kyiv will not fall. I don't care how long it's going to take. I think he's going to lose all those advantages that he's got. So it's going to turn over to diplomats. How do you work your way out of this? And I think to the Ukrainians' credit, and I'll close with this, there's an old Napoleonic axiom. The morale to the physical is 3:1. I mean, you never discount the fighting ability of an army on the ground, and they are proving it. I'll put it in Kellogg's simple terms. It's not the size of the dog in the fight that counts. It's the size of the fight of the dog. And think about that. And that's what you see with Ukraine.
I think I'll write that down. Thank you, General. And when we get to the end, when we open up the floor, I'm interested in this question of the success of the southern part of the country and into Donbass, and if they can link that up with Moldova, whether they can in fact landlock Ukraine. That I think is still an open question. If they do that, maybe the Russians have won something. So I'm interested to hear about that. Our second speaker is Michael Hanlon of Brookings Institution. He's a senior fellow there and director of research in foreign policy at Brookings. He specializes in U.S. defense strategy and the use of military force and American national security policy. He directs the Brookings Center on Security Strategy and Technology. Michael, thank you very much for being here.
Governor, thank you, and it's nice to see you again. Been an admirer of your career for a long time. General Kellogg, great to be on the panel with you, and Ambassador Taylor. Hi, everybody. Let me just do a couple of things. That was a great military analysis, and I only have a couple of things to add to it. Let me tell a quick Fiona Hill story of my own, since she's my good friend and colleague before and after her service in the Trump administration. And this one's just pure humor, but I hope you'll indulge me. So the first day of the Trump administration, maybe it was the second, it was her first day in the office, and she was on the NSC, so she didn't need to await confirmation. So she was ready to go, except her daughter got sick the night before. It was a rainy, terrible night in Bethesda. She's also my neighbor, in addition to being my friend and colleague. And this is in her book, this story. So she, she's up half the night with her daughter, trying to get her to feel better, and goes out to the store to get some stuff to help her daughter keep things down in her stomach, and manages to slam the car door against her face, give herself a nice big black eye. And then the next morning, she hasn't yet gone to the White House to work because it's her first day. It's the Trump administration's just arrived. And so she doesn't have any clothes pre-deployed to the office like she normally would, including shoes. So she plans to walk. She walks to the metro 1.25 miles every day. She's this good, hardy Scottish lady, and from coal mining country, the old English Scotland border zone of UK. And so she prepares to walk to the metro in her sneakers, and she's going to carry her nice shoes, but she forgets them. And meanwhile, the shoes that she's wearing, the sneakers that she's wearing to walk to the metro, are the same ones that her daughter had thrown up on the night before. So now you can maybe some of you are already going to be able to guess what's coming. So she's like, well, what's the worst that can happen? It's the first day. I'm just going to fill out some forms. Blah, blah, blah. It's going to happen. I'm not going to have to go to any really important meetings. General Kellogg will forgive me. He's seen worse. He's been in combat. But it turns out there was a terrorist attack that day or that morning already in Russia. One part of the story, it's not funny, but there was an attack. So they had to have an Oval Office meeting. Maybe you were there too. And President Trump's there. And she's wearing her vomit-laced sneakers. And of course, President Trump, ultimately, with all due apology or respect to the president, he barely notices, to be honest. So she gets out of this meeting just fine in terms of H.R. McMaster just said, hide your shoes under the couch, or tuck your feet in under the couch and nobody will notice. So it's all going good. They're about to leave the room. And then they get called back in because there's a new intelligence update they have to process. And who arrives? Ivanka. And Ivanka sits next to Fiona. And you can bet she did not miss the shoes.
That's true.
Given the nature of our subject, I couldn't resist starting with that. I also want to say, I was not a big Trump supporter myself, although General Kellogg and I had some nice conversations over the years. And there were a couple of things that I tried to support with President Trump, where he would, I thought, potentially usefully be a useful disruptor. At least there was the potential for that. And even though I didn't really agree with the way he felt about Vladimir Putin, I thought that his desire to defuse a little bit of the US-Russia tension could be useful. And Fiona and I were going to write a book together, which I had to write myself once she hired her, which was about an alternative security architecture for Eastern Europe that would be founded on the principle of neutrality for Ukraine and Georgia. And I always thought we had gotten too ambitious in trying to extend NATO as far eastward as we did. And I got some good company in this argument. Bill Burns, it's in his memoirs, obviously George Kennan, Bill Perry, and a few others. But the foreign policy consensus on both the Democratic and Republican parties is against us and in favor of NATO expansion, and constructed this concept they called an open door policy, which, if you actually read the Washington Treaty, is not in the Washington Treaty. Article 10 says that existing members may invite new members if they believe that doing so would contribute to the stability of the North Atlantic region. There's not some general carte blanche. You can just bring anybody in you want without thinking through. Anyway, that debate is now overtaken by events, to say the least, except that the one point everybody's prepared to concede is Ukraine won't be in NATO. And so we have to concede it now. Maybe it would have been better if we had thought about it harder earlier. So I want to, one little thing I'm trying to do in my 10 minutes is to inject a couple of contrarian views into American consensus foreign policy thinking. Because I think sometimes, as big and smart as our country is, as vigorous as our politics are, as contentious as our think tank and academic debates can be, we are sometimes prone to groupthink. And we do have to be careful here to not make the punishment of Russia our actual strategy. I think the punishment of Russia needs to be a policy that advances a strategic goal, but the punishment is not strategy itself. We don't need another Weimar Republic of the 1920s in the form of Russia in the 2020s once this whole thing is done. So I'll just put that concept on the table as well. Just a couple of small points on military analysis to add to General Kellogg's excellent and much more learned and experienced background than I have, but this is also sort of what I do in my work. And another interesting mistake the Russians made, maybe three more. One, they communicated in the open, and of course, it's hard to have enough encrypted phones for 200,000 troops, but you would think that you wouldn't be so easily overheard by the other side. Second, they failed to appreciate how much Ukraine could contest the air. And they should have known, because they make pretty good surface-to-air missile systems. They should have known the potential of modern air defenses, even if Ukraine doesn't have a lot of airplanes. They do have some, of course, and we've debated how many more we should try to get them, but they have air defense systems, which are pretty potent. And I think that has prevented Russia from doing a lot of what it thought it could do easily, moving around the country to Badlands country, where they realize they can't really easily arrive by land, but maybe they thought they could arrive by air. Turns out to have been much harder. And then finally, sort of a compliment to General Kellogg's point about the road system. The Russians apparently did not do what any proper combined arms maneuver force would do, which is to have dismounted infantry on the side of your columns, so that if there are people trying to come at you and fire javelin missiles and do a shoot and scoot, you don't give them that opportunity, or at least you contest their effort to do that. Whereas what the Russians did was more like what an untrained non-soldier like me would probably, the truck looks better than being outside. It's warmer inside. At least they got a little bit of metal between me and the enemy. Problem is, if everybody thinks that way, you're collectively vulnerable. And so it, to me, reminded me a bit of the way the Soviets fought the Finns in 1939, 1940. They would come down with these fairly underprepared, smaller forces down these forest roads with big, trees on either side. And the Finns would use these Madi tactics. They would target the beginning and the end of the column, maybe even drop some trees to further complicate the movement, and then destroy the rest of the position in detail. Like you said, you fight independently, so you get killed independently. And that's what happened in 1939, 1940. And to some extent, we've seen the repeat of that. However, I'm not overconfident that that will continue. If, as the fields dry out in the east, the Russians can go off-road a little bit more easily. And they might, just like you said, just keep sort of slugging away for modest territorial gains. And I'm not sure that Ukraine really is going to have a great response to that. So I don't necessarily think that time is on the side of Ukraine. And I think we may have to think cleverly about the kind of diplomatic packages where we have to hold our nose and do some kind of a deal with Putin. And I'm getting near the end of my 10 minutes, so I don't really want to throw out too much there, but I'm afraid that we may have to think about at least encouraging the Ukrainians to consider some modest forms of territorial compromise. It repulses me to have to think and say that. I don't really want to be the guy to go say that to President Zelensky. That's a hard thing for somebody to say about, someone else's territory and country. But I don't know if there are concepts of shared sovereignty, if there are concepts of international mediation on where borders should be, if there are ways to sort of deflect or defuse or transmutate this issue a little bit into a form where it's a little more palatable for the Ukrainians to consider. And I'm not suggesting that Putin should get everything he's able to take now. I'm not suggesting that it's just sort of, possession is 9/10 of the law. But I do worry that if we don't have the willingness, or if we don't encourage our Ukrainian friends to have the willingness to at least think of a little bit of compromise on territory, that there may never be an end to this. And also, I think we're going to have to consider what form of sanctions, of partial sanctions relief, we would consider for the Russians. Some kinds of limits on high technology acquisition, I believe, should stay in place as long as Putin's president. And I think a lot of American and Western companies are not going to go back to Russia as long as Putin's president. So there will be some enduring pain, and there should be. But I think we're going to have to, again, make sure that the Russia after this war does not become the 100 years later equivalent of the 1920s Weimar Republic for the good of stability in Europe. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
That's very good. And I have been a Fiona Hill watcher myself. Some things I agree with that she says, and some things I don't agree with that she says. But I don't want to watch as close as her speakers. I'll be careful about that. The other observation I have is that neutrality for Ukraine and Georgia was it's really kind of up to them. Neither of those countries, when I was at OSCE, indicated they wanted to be neutral. So we just have those issues, I think, still ahead of us also. So I'm looking forward to that further conversation. Our third speaker is Ambassador Bill Taylor, a friend of this organization. He spoke yesterday at our lunch and gave us a good summary, and now he can add to that, I think, today. He's the Vice President for Europe, Russia and Europe at the U.S. Institute for Peace. He served as U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine from 2006 to 2009. In 2019, he served as Charge d'Affaires at the U.S. Embassy in Kyiv. So this is a very distinguished person who's an expert in the field, and we're delighted to have you here, Bill. Thank you very much.
Joe, thank you very much. It's an honor to be here. Speak to many of you whom I spoke to yesterday, although not these two here that will follow over to having Anders and Lou coming up here, but also with Kellogg and Mike. So it's great to be here. Let me, since I did get up here yesterday to most of you, let me just make a couple of observations that we get to the NATO expansion. I'm one of the majority. I hear you minority, but I will say that I think NATO expansion was a good idea. The reason is that the East European, in, 91 and 89 when the wall fell in 91. I was at US NATO at the time, so I watched this in real time close. And over time, and people in this room actually served in some of these nations when they were thinking through joining NATO. So this will be an interesting part of the conversation after that. But East European nations, some of them in the Warsaw Pact, some of them in the Soviet Union, looked at Russia. And they knew Russian history better than Americans, clearly. And going back centuries, the Russians have been ruled by autocrats, whether it's Tsars or commissars or Putin. So it's not just Putin. And Russia is not just autocratic, but also aggressive, also expansionist. So this is not irrational for these nations to look to see how they're going to secure themselves and to apply to NATO. It's not open door, I take that point. But it does say that any European nation can apply. And then exactly what you said after that, it's up to the members of NATO, as we all know, to say yes. Which gets into Georgia and Ukraine. So I was also in Kiev in 2008 for the famous Bucharest summit. So NATO gets together every year, and in 2008 it was in Bucharest, and one item on the agenda was actually two items: membership action plan applications from Ukraine and Georgia. So Ukraine and Georgia were interested to begin the process of joining NATO. Membership action plan is that mechanism, and that was on the table. So in preparation for that summit, President Bush and Connie Rice and Steve Hadley and others, David Wilson, showed up in Kiev just before going to Bucharest, because they wanted to talk to President Yushchenko at the time about NATO membership. Yushchenko was very interested in it. I will admit that if you took a poll of Ukrainians in 2008 about NATO membership, you probably got 20%. You maybe got 25%, depending on how you phrase the question. But the leadership, that is the president, was eager to start the process. Other nations, other East European nations, started off less than 50%. So it was not crazy to think about that kind of approach. So on to Bucharest, where the conversation didn't go well. President Bush was able to make the case. I just talked to the Ukrainians. I was just in Kiev. I talked to the military. I talked to the civil society. I talked to the president. And they're committed and they've got the values and they're focused. But the Germans and the French didn't know. So the membership action plans were not approved. This, by the way, was also the summit that Vladimir Putin showed up. And he famously leaned over to President Bush. Ukraine's not really a nation, which we see more recently in this big, long 5,000-word document that Putin apparently writes last summer with the same story. Ukraine's not really a nation. He goes back in history and tries to make the case that Ukraine's really just little Russia. It's little Russians, and there can only be sovereign under Russian control. Which is exactly what Putin wanted. Governor, you're exactly right. He wanted and still wants and will continue to want Ukraine under control for legacy purposes, exactly what you said, and others. But back to Bucharest. So they turned to the Bucharest summit. The leaders said no. They did put in the final communique that we all know how the communique is written, that Ukraine and Georgia will become members of it. That's probably a problem, maybe even a cause of this current invasion, this current conflict. I argue the opposite. I would argue that in a counterfactual, that if the Bucharest summit had said yes to the no extraction ban, that you probably wouldn't have this fight today. You probably would not have this war today. If Ukraine were a member of NATO, had actually begun the process and had become a member of NATO, then you wouldn't have this. And Ukraine would indeed be part of Europe in a real sense. And as it was, Ukraine wasn't allowed. It now is or it did consider neutrality. So fast forward from Bucharest up to now, up to about a month ago, when the idea of neutrality was on the table. I say a month ago because when this discussion took place between some Ukrainians and some Russians, first on the border of Belarus and Ukraine, and then later in Istanbul, these discussions led to some questions, some ideas about neutrality. And I say a month ago because that was before Bucha. That was before the atrocities that have colored the thoughts and the thinking of Ukrainians as well as the international community. And Ukrainians now wonder, is it possible to have a conversation with the Russians who are, in President Biden's words, genocidal, at least war criminal? Can you have a conversation? Can you negotiate with these folks at this time? So, and they're not the Ukrainians. I talk to them every day. I've talked to a couple people who are on these negotiating teams on the Ukrainian side, and others who have advised the Ukrainians who are on negotiating. And they are not eager to do this. The enthusiasm, the interest in neutrality, interested in negotiations, is way down. It's not zero. You have to do it for the reasons that we've talked about. But in terms of compromises, territorial compromises, Ukrainians are not there. Ukrainians are not there. Zelensky has said, just the last couple of days, that he's not going to cede territory to the Russians. Shared sovereignty, he can't do that. He doesn't want to do that. Ukrainian people don't want to do that. Ukrainian people and Zelensky, as I mentioned yesterday, are really, really in sync. He understands them, they support him, and territorial compromise is just not there at the moment in the context of these atrocities. So that may come later. Now, I don't think that it'll come in terms of territorial compromise, but some negotiations may well come when two things happen. Neither side is now ready. Neither side is ready for these negotiations to take place. So it's not right, as they say, but at some point it might be. At some point it might be. The Ukrainians now think that they're actually doing pretty well. Ukrainians think that they are doing pretty well, and they are. There's counteroffensives in the north around Kharkiv that are succeeding in some real sense. We know what happened in Kiev, but it's happening again around Kharkiv. The Russians think that as long as they've got some people they can throw into this fight, they're not going to give up. I don't think they're going to be able to get to even Odessa, much less Moldova. So I think that there is the probability of a free Ukraine that is able to, with support from the West, that is able to develop, maybe join the EU, maybe not be neutral, maybe give up on this neutrality idea, maybe be able to accept weapons and support, economic support, rebuilding support from the West in a way that allows them at some point to be part of Europe. So not the neutrality. Let me stop there, Governor.
Master, thank you. That's extremely helpful. Actually, this panel could justify a whole morning's conference, as you could see, but we have reserved some time for Q&A from the audience. I would just note that I think it's very difficult for them to cede sovereign territory at this point. Very difficult because they've lost so many people. They've lost so many civilians. There's so much violence that's been done. How do you turn to the people of Ukraine at this point and say, well, we're gonna reward the Russians for their aggression by giving them dog bones. How do you do that? I know. So that's, and I don't even think that's a good idea personally, but then I'm kind of all, well, never mind. We'll open the floor now to this distinguished group of people for a few minutes. And delighted that we have a few minutes. We'll start here and then we'll go first.
How we describe the US policy in this war seems important, and it looks like the administration is somewhat changing the way it describes it. In fact, today, I don't recall anybody saying total victory for Ukraine is the policy, but weakening Russia is the policy. And that concerns me. If you look at the votes in the UN General Assembly, every time the issue comes up, we lose more and more states who abstain because they're beginning to see this, whether it's Singapore or India or Indonesia, as a reenactment of the Cold War. It's US against Russia, so why should they get involved? How important is it to have nations like India and Indonesia and Singapore supporting the US policy and recognizing that Russian aggression is a violation of everything in the post-World War II order that we have sought to establish?
Right, quickly, gentlemen, anybody would like to take that on? All three, probably.
Well, I tell you what, in the interest of time, because it's a great question, I think really these two gentlemen have left about it. I would like to see their response go. Mike as well.
I'll start briefly, and in the spirit of being concise, I would simply say, to me, it's understandable that countries don't want to join this when they don't really see what our strategy is for ending the war. And I concede the point that the governor and the ambassador have made that it's very hard to really for us to propose a territorial concession. And so I don't know what terms we can specifically put on the table. I might be willing, sitting here in comfortable Washington, to accept a certain territorial concession in good peace. I don't know, however, how I can make that happen, even if I was president of the United States. So I think we have to let the process become right. But in the meantime, we've got to articulate the reality that what General Austin, Secretary Austin said last week, which may have been true on its own terms, that we are trying to weaken Russia in some specific sense, is not itself the end game, is not the grand strategy. And until Indonesia and India and Singapore know what our overall strategy is, and it should be the stability of Europe, including the revival of Russia someday, we should be able to say that, then I think it's understandable that they wouldn't want to join it.
Can I, before the ambassador, in 30 seconds, what I think I'd ask all of you to think about is, who can be the interlocutor? Who is the person, people that are out there that can bring this to a conclusion? It's not the United States. I mean, you've got a president that Putin will not talk to at all. So yeah, I'll start asking you a question. How does this end?
So, how does this end, and who's the interlocutor? And so far, we've had some people stepping up, and they haven't really gotten very much traction. UN General didn't get very far. The Turks haven't gotten, airlines. People suggest Chinese. That's probably a bad idea. But speaking of Chinese, it goes back to this question about the UN votes. So the UN vote's pretty interesting, actually. When the question of condemning Russia for that invasion was put, well, we know what happened in the Security Council, 10-1. Chinese abstained in the Security Council. Okay, so the Chinese did not support it when it went to the General Assembly. 141 to 5. 141 to 5 with what? 35 abstentions. The five, we got Russia, and we got Belarus, and we got North Korea, Cuba and Eritrea, those are the ones. That's okay. That's a group. That kind of support. Now, the abstentions are interesting, it's true. China's in there. China didn't support the Russians, they didn't support the condemnation either, but and nor did the Indians, and those, and there have been other votes. But the other votes, though, have not been on this question of condemning Russia for the invasion. The other votes were, kicking Russia out of the Human Rights Council or whatever it was. But the focus one was 141 to 5. I think that's strong support. And your question about, is it important to get the Indians? Sure. One reason you'd like to have the Indians is so that they don't undercut the sanctions. I'm sure you'll be talking about sanctions later on today. And so that's important. The Chinese have not undercut the sanctions, and nor have they provided weapons. And the Russians have been asking for both, and they've gotten neither. So I think that's important to observe.
Jim Rosenberg.
Thank you very much. I asked,
I asked Ambassador Taylor yesterday, so I'm not gonna put him on the spot again. I want to ask our two other guests. I think I understand why our intelligence was so bad on the Russian army. I don't understand why our intelligence was so bad on the Ukrainian army and on the Ukrainians. I'd be interested in your perspective on that. Yeah, I think it's a great question. I mean, it's, by the way, it's just, the only thing I could think of when I was looking at that out there, go back to Afghanistan and other places, is sometimes, fair or unfair, we image our opponents in our own way of doing it. We don't look through the lens of the opponent. In fact, that, like when Fiona used to tell me that, don't look through our lens. What is this guy thinking? And it's right. It goes back to actually 500 BC with Sun Tzu, who wrote a great book called The Art of War, which required reading of all the military. And he basically said three things, and I'll simplify them. He said, if you don't know yourself and you don't know the enemy, you will lose all of your battles. If you know yourself and don't know the enemy, you will win 50-50. If you don't know yourself and you don't know the enemy, you're gonna lose all of them. Okay, and I just get the feeling that somehow, for whatever reason, it's something we need to look at really hard, is why we made these mistakes. That, by the way, that was, and you look at it yesterday, I was watching the hearings yesterday, when they had, I think it was the director of the DIA on there, and he said, we had great intelligence, and he just got slammed. I mean, it was like, excuse me, you know, he was gonna fall in 3 days, you had the German trenches out there, check that out there, and you didn't get it. So it's a great question. It's something I think we need to think about, because all of us fell into the trap of looking at it like in a different way. And it's scary because what else have they got wrong? I don't know.
So that was great analysis. Let me just add, I was at the DIA all day last Tuesday, speaking with General Merrier and others, and I think they feel good that they saw this coming and they won the internal debate. Remember, by December, the whole US government was saying Putin's going to invade. Right? I didn't really believe it myself, but they had more information than I did, and the DIA helped convince others that in fact the intelligence was accurate. So, and then they are, you know, well, we've seen in the newspaper that they are helping the Ukrainians in various ways, perhaps. So I think they feel justifiably proud about some of that. But I agree with General Kellogg that, you know, there's always this temptation in war to, if you think the battle plan of the enemy is promising, we had this in 2003 with the invasion, or we thought it would be quick and easy. We had shock and awe. And we sort of, we did mirror image. We gave Putin the credit that for a shock and awe strategy that might be successful. But the last point I'll make is that we acted on this intelligence and we helped Zelensky survive in the early days, as best I can tell. This is not something I learned last week at DIA. This is things I've read elsewhere. And so at least we had the courage of our conviction to use that expectation of the potential for a rapid Russian win to make it less likely, to help Zelensky protect himself, and then to help him protect the airfield north of Kyiv. And so those are some of the ways in which we help them diffuse this shock and awe strategy. So at least we did that right.
Yeah, one quick indicator, I'm a big believer in indicators, you know, just by basic training. But the reason why, think about what we tried to do with Zelensky early on. We wanted him out of there. And if we wanted him out of there, that's when he said, I don't need to write any ammunition. You know, you kind of say, okay, we were thinking that this country was falling pretty bad. And I always looked at those indicators, and if you looked at the indicators right before the invasion, they were frankly screaming at me. Every one of them was coming. They were in attack positions and ready to go. At that time, still people were saying, they're not coming across, they're not coming across. And I'm telling you, every indicator I had at that time is a military, former military, was yeah, they're going. There's no doubt in my mind.
I have two more questions on the table. If Phil will grant me a couple extra minutes, and then we will conclude. Stuart.
You guys are awesome. This is so good. Based on the way things are gone, could Putin be overthrown or taken out?
Also, there's a question here, I don't have time for Louise.
Oh, well, and also Jim White. So we have three questions. Well, can Putin be overthrown, Louise? What's your question?
My question is to go back to General Kellogg's comment about the fact that this is sort of an indirect war between two nuclear powers, and that the slow response of the US to really get actively engaged in the beginning was because of the fear of escalation, because of the nuclear aspect. What is your thought in terms of the use of possible tactical nuclear weapons, or Putin's using that in order to pursue.
Can it be overthrown? What's the danger of tactical nuclear weapons in this nuclear environment? Tim, did you have a third question?
Yes, sir, I'll make it brief. In terms of Western support, the notion would seem to be how much and what. Both General Kellogg and Mike mentioned air defense. My question has to do with whether or not a half dozen or fewer MiG-29s are going to make any difference, or whether that was simply a stalking horse for more S-300s, more air to ground and ground to ground and ground to air missiles. In other words, are there going to be aircraft flying over Ukraine? Would that help turn the tide?
Putin, nukes, and
I'll go to one real quick one. If I was Vladimir Putin right now, I would increase my body nerves and I was also have a food taster. If there's no time, the threat is going to be there. Internally, I think the threat there. Do I think it's going to happen in the near term? I don't, but I think the threat is very real, especially if this thing continues to go bad. But he's not adverse to throwing people in jail, as you did as fifth director of AFPI responsible for Ukraine. As the nuclear missiles, I've gone back and forth, because it's in their doctrine, and they could use a demonstration, and they do have sub-kiloton weapons. Well, what we call tactical nuclear weapons, which I hate that term, but something that kill city blocks, they don't kill cities. We don't have that in the US. We stopped having that in the 60s when we had such a problem. The Davy Crockett, we decided that we didn't want to start World War III. So they do that, it's in their philosophy to do it. And I could see them doing a demonstration, shoot a rocket in the field or a missile in the nuclear weapon field underwater. And they're very low yield. I mean, they will destroy a city block, but they won't destroy the city, so they can do that. And then the third one was on
Air defense.
yeah, anything you give them, I give Zelensky on a battleship, I give them. The fact is, it does count because it's what you are doing when you do that. It's not so much sometimes with material, which is always important. And if you got those 29 MiGs, that would increase the Air Force by 1/3. And the Russians still don't have air dominance. But more importantly, you're getting in the head of your opponent. If they see this coming in, they realize, if you keep giving them all this stuff, this becomes a zero-sum game. I can't win this fight. So how do I get out of this fight? And right now, we're doing an incredible amount of slow one, which we didn't do earlier. We should have given it earlier. Should have given them air defense earlier. We should have given them the long-range artillery. We should have allowed the Poles to make sure they got those MiGs early. But we are giving them good information. We're giving them intelligence as well. But I think more importantly, is how do you get inside of the generals, Gerasimov and Shevardov, and also Vladimir Putin's head.
I'll just touch briefly on one question, which was the regime change question. I don't disagree at all with what General Kellogg said. However, I'm nervous about if we make the sloppy then next step, which you did not, but some people might, of essentially building our policy on that hope. Because what I've seen in my career, getting to be a long career now, is whenever we hoped for the overthrow of a leader we thought was fundamentally weak, it didn't happen. It didn't happen with the North Korean leadership in the 1990s when they lost all their Soviet and Chinese subsidies and still managed to hold on to power. It didn't happen with Saddam when we thought that there were various ways to signal opposition in his country that they could expect American help in one form or another if they revolted. And it hasn't happened in other places as well. It didn't happen against the Castros. It hasn't happened in Venezuela. One thing that these really bad people tend to be pretty good at is protecting themselves and holding on to power. So I hope I'm wrong, but it shouldn't be the basis for our policy.
Agree with that. That sounds exactly right. On the weapons, on the air defense, it's coming. It is now coming. There's now talk about even starting training on F-15 to F-16 over time, because this may be a long battle. And so now there's some consideration starting that kind of thing. Ukrainians think they can be trained up quickly, but that's there. But in the near term, these Soviet era air defense weapons are being provided. We don't have them, but we're helping get them there. Getting them into the country is a challenge, but the Ukrainians are doing that well, not through rail as much as through trucks. So that's coming in. The long range artillery should have come earlier. Absolutely agree. I got a friend of mine is on the front line right now, And he sent me this morning on YouTube on these 155 hours in action and taking out tanks at like 40 kilometers. So that's happening. It should have happened earlier, but that can give the Ukrainians the edge in order to at least come to the stalemate.
Well, I think that Ukraine may not be able to be segmented out from the larger, longer war that I think we're engaged in against the authoritarians who want to disrupt the international order. And that is the worrisome thing. But if we do get into a long war with multiple people, ultimately we're going to win because of our values and because the people who are with us in the long run. Meanwhile, the people in this audience have all been distinguished representatives of the United States. They're entitled to excellent presentations. You three have measured up exactly to that standard. So thank you very much.